Somalia, which was recently named by Osama bin Laden to be the third most important battlefield after Iraq and Afghanistan, has been at war with Ethiopia for a number of weeks now. To fully understand the situation, however, we turn to senior analyst Ray Ryan for her editorial on the region.
Somalia, a Muslim state, and Ethiopia, a Christian stronghold, have been in a constant state of tension and war for around 1,000 years. Though there were several small wars, the region was somewhat stable until the 1990s, when resistance groups backed by Ethiopia began gaining power and led to civil war. Since 1990, there has been no unifying government in Somalia. Instead, sections of Somalia broke off and declared independence while secular warlords claimed power. Because of the confusion, there was popular support for Sharia, a traditional form of Islamic law that dictates much day-to-day life and is implemented through Islamic courts. Its strict nature gave a sense of stability to the region for many people. In June of 2006, the Somali Islamic Courts Council took power after violently kicking U.S. and Ethiopian-backed warlords out of Mogadishu, Somalia's capital. Meanwhile, a completely separate group of Somalis in Kenya drew up a charter called the Transitional Federal Parliament. The UN and wider international community recognize this government, even though it has no power and no popular support in Somalia itself. Since the government had no military strength, the US was worried about the prospect of a vulnerable state turning into a terrorist stronghold. The US turned to Ethiopia to act as a stabilizing power. With full US backing and military training, at least 15,000 Ethiopian troops entered into an illegal war against the Islamic courts in late December 2006. So far, the Islamic courts have called for peace and withdrew from Mogadishu, but the government did not return the goodwill. In a recent gathering to discuss the future plans of Somalia, the Islamic court was not invited. On the other hand, since the government is internationally recognized, the Somali militias are seen as an Islamic movement attempting to overthrow the so-called legitimate government. The best antidote to terrorism in Somalia is stability. The international community seems surprised that so many Somalis would support the Islamic courts over the US and Ethiopia, but not only have they been in conflict with Ethiopia for 1,000 years, reason enough to be defensive, they probably feel the US views their country as nothing more than a terrorist cell. And their suspicions were partly confirmed on Sunday, January 7th, when the U.S. became directly involved in the conflict by leading an airstrike in the southern town of Dobli. They succeeded in killing known al-Qaeda terrorist Fazul Abdullah Mohammed. This small victory, however, does not justify the provocation of a war that, like the current one in Iraq, is impossible to control. Invading Somalia under false pretenses to attempt stabilization, but in fact making things infinitely worse by forcing people to accept an externally controlled government, somehow that sounds familiar. Al-Qaeda has recognized this weakness, and by calling for uprisings from Somali militias, feeds U.S. paranoia, which in turn fuels Somali indignation and anger. Some Somalis have already answered the call, but since the West seems adamant in backing the already vulnerable and unpopular government, to the Somalis, it might seem like they have no other choice.
Thank you, Ray. And number one on In Case You Missed It was a major news story for much of break, Saddam Hussein's recent trial and execution. Many countries and rights groups around the world expressed the hope that the trial and execution of Saddam Hussein would prove a turning point for the people of Iraq. Their hopes were somewhat dashed, however, when two major issues arose concerning the process. The first issue was whether former President Hussein was given a fair trial. Hussein was being tried for his role in the 1982 killings of 148 people in Dujau, a mostly Shiite town north of Baghdad. On November 5, 2006, Hussein was sentenced to death by hanging. Hussein's attorney appealed, but the Iraqi High Tribunal's appellate chamber upheld the sentence, and Judge Arif Shaheen said the court's decision was the final word in the case. The judge's decision was controversial for some because Iraqi law requires a death sentence to be carried out within 30 days, leaving little room for appeal. Hussein's defense attorneys, backed by the voices of many international human rights groups, said that among other things, the judge was under pressure to rule harshly against Hussein. Human Rights Watch, who previously spoke out against Hussein's rule, released a 97-page review of the proceedings, saying Hussein's trial was, quote, marred by so many procedural flaws that the verdict is unsound. Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki ignored the Iraqi law that requires every death penalty sentence to be ratified by the High Judicial Council, instead ratifying it himself. The Iraqi government ignored cries for a retrial or postponement of the execution. Al-Maliki acknowledged that the U.S. ambassador to Iraq asked him to postpone the execution by 10 days to 2 weeks. Al-Maliki said, quote, "We refused because the tension in the country was high. We didn't want to leave the door open for trouble, and we didn't want the victims' families to take streets in protest." The other main issue surrounding the case was the execution itself. Cell phone videotapes taken illegitimately by unknown persons were released on the internet. In the video, taunts from Shiites can be heard moments before Hussein, a Sunni, was hanged. The taunts and arguments in the video, as well as the general way the trial was held, has fed Sunni fears that Prime Minister al-Maliki's Shiite-led government carried out a sectarian lynching rather than a legitimate execution. With all the controversy, many are concerned that Hussein will be remembered less as a villain and more as a martyr.